Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let us drift back in time to the restless seas of the 17th and 18th centuries, a time known as the Golden Age of Piracy. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow the rhythm of history to carry you across the waves. The story begins in the late 1600s. After long wars between European empires, vast fleets had crossed the Atlantic, bringing back silver, gold, and treasures from the Americas. But where there is wealth, there is always someone willing to seize it. Out of the chaos of war and trade, the age of the pirate was born. The story of piracy, before it became the stuff of legend, begins quietly in the tangled aftermath of empire, war, and hunger. To understand why men and women took to the sea as pirates, we must drift back to the closing years of the 17th century, when Europe was a continent scarred by endless conflict. Nations fought one another not only for power at home, but for the control of distant colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The sea was the bridge between worlds, the highway upon which wealth traveled, and it was along this highway that piracy was born. In these years, great fleets carried gold and silver mined in the mountains of Peru and Mexico. Spanish galleons lumbered across the Atlantic, their holds filled with treasure that would feed kings, build palaces, and pay for armies in Europe. Merchant ships carried sugar, tobacco, indigo, and rum, goods produced on the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas. These cargoes were worth fortunes, and yet the men who sailed the ships often lived in desperate poverty. The contrast between the treasures of the New World and the hunger of those who worked upon the sea created fertile soil for rebellion. Before piracy, as we know it took shape, there were privateers. A privateer was, in essence, a legalized pirate. During wartime, governments issued what were called letters of marque, papers that gave permission for ship captains to attack the vessels of enemy nations. For a sailor, this was an opportunity. Under the flag of their king or queen, they could capture ships, plunder their cargoes, and legally keep a share of the spoils. To their patrons, they were patriots, heroes even. To those they attacked, they were nothing more than thieves at sea. The system of privateering flourished during the endless wars of the 17th century. The English crown, for instance, was only too glad to unleash privateers against Spanish treasure fleets. For decades, the Caribbean was the stage upon which these state-sanctioned predators played their part. Some grew immensely wealthy, building reputations that would later bleed into pirate legend. Others died penniless, their gamble yielding nothing but hardship. But when peace treaties were signed, when wars ended, the letters of marque were revoked. A man who had once been a lawful privateer, respected for harassing the enemy, suddenly found himself unemployed, his skills unwanted, his ship idle. Many sailors, hardened by years of raiding, refused to simply return to lives of quiet poverty, and so, with no nation's blessing, they continued to do what they knew best. They preyed upon the sea. The leap from privateer to pirate was, in truth, a small step. The world called them criminals now, but to themselves little had changed. The targets were the same, the seas the same, the plunder just as sweet. What had vanished was only the stamp of a monarch's approval. Out of this thin line between legality and outlawry, piracy began to grow, spilling beyond the boundaries of war into the everyday commerce of empires. Another root of piracy lay in the brutal conditions of life at sea. Sailors were poorly paid, often cheated of their wages, and subjected to harsh discipline. A captain on a merchant ship or naval vessel wielded near-total authority. Disobedience could mean lashes across the back, confinement in chains, or even death. Food was scarce, and when it was available, it was often rotting, crawling with maggots. Fresh water went foul after weeks in the barrels. Disease stalked the crews, scurvy, dysentery, fever. For the common sailor, Life aboard a ship was more prison than adventure. Against this backdrop, piracy offered something different, still dangerous, still harsh, but with a promise of freedom, equality, and perhaps fortune. By the end of the 17th century, the Caribbean was alive with opportunity for those willing to break the law. European empires had spread themselves thin, establishing colonies, forts, and plantations across vast distances. Their naval power, though formidable, could not be everywhere at once. Ships laden with sugar, rum, gold, and silver made tempting targets as they passed through narrow channels and across open seas. The geography of the Caribbean favored ambush. Countless islands, hidden coves, and shallow waters provided shelter for fast ships waiting in silence. The first great wave of pirates emerged here, in the aftermath of the wars between England, Spain, and France. Among them were the buccaneers, hunters and sailors who had once made their living on the islands of Hispaniola and Tortuga. Originally, these men smoked and sold meat to passing ships. The word buccaneer comes from boucan, a wooden frame used to cook meat slowly over a fire. But when Spanish authorities tried to drive them out, they turned to raiding ships and settlements instead. By the mid-1600s, they had become notorious across the Caribbean, their names feared along the coasts of Spanish America. It was from these buccaneers, these rough men of the sea and the islands, that the culture of piracy began to take shape. They lived without regard for the laws of empire, forging communities bound by brotherhood rather than loyalty to crown. They experimented with codes of conduct, agreements that laid out how plunder would be divided, how injuries would be compensated, and how discipline would be enforced. These early pirate codes were rough charters of fairness, created in defiance of the brutal hierarchies of the Navy. For a sailor who had known nothing but the whip of a captain, the promise of a voice in decision-making was intoxicating. As the decades passed, the distinction between buccaneer and pirate blurred. The age of exploration had given way to the age of commerce, and the oceans were crowded with ships bearing goods across every horizon. Every war that erupted in Europe created new privateers, and every peace that followed left those same men stranded and desperate. Slowly, the figure of the independent pirate emerged, no longer tied to a single island or cause, but free, ranging across seas in search of plunder. The origins of piracy, then, were tangled threads of war, poverty, opportunity, and rebellion. A man might have begun his career as a loyal sailor, serving his nation's interests with courage. He might have fought bravely against enemy fleets, captured prizes for his king, and dreamed of glory. But when the war ended, when the king no longer had need of him, he would be cast aside, with no land to return to, no fortune saved, and no skills beyond the handling of a ship and a sword. The choice to turn pirate was often less a matter of greed than survival. It is important to understand that piracy did not appear suddenly, nor was it a single movement. It was more like a tide, swelling and receding with the currents of empire. Each peace treaty signed in Europe sent another wave of hardened, unemployed sailors out into the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Each convoy of treasure ships tempted them to risk the hangman's noose for the chance of a prize. And each brutal lash struck upon the back of a common sailor whispered the promise that somewhere out there was a ship where men were equals, where the plunder would be shared, and where no tyrant's whip would crack. The true origin of piracy, then, was not simply greed, but disillusionment. It was the betrayal felt by men who had risked their lives in service of crown and empire, only to be discarded when they were no longer useful. It was the hunger of men who saw ships heavy with treasure pass before their eyes while they themselves starved. It was the longing for freedom in the hearts of sailors who had known only chains. In this sense, piracy was not only a crime, but a form of protest, a desperate grasp for dignity upon the cruel stage of the sea. As the 17th century slipped into the 18th, the world would come to know the pirate not just as a figure of rebellion, but as a legend. Yet before those legends, before Blackbeard, before Annebonny, before Calico Jack, the seeds were sown in the struggles of nameless sailors, in the wars of kings, and in the restless hunger of men cast adrift upon the waves of history. These origins, quiet and relentless, would ignite what we now remember as the Golden Age of Piracy. But when you trace the story back to its beginning, you find not only swords and ships, but the silent heartbreak of men who chose to defy a world that had given them nothing. And in their defiance, they built a shadow kingdom upon the sea, born of hunger, war, and dreams of freedom, and so the story of piracy began. With men staring at the horizon, with ships rocking gently in the harbors of the Caribbean, with whispers among sailors that perhaps, just perhaps, the sea could be a place of equality, and the night wind a cloak for those who refused to kneel. The Golden Age of Piracy, often spoken of in hushed tones as if it were some dreamlike age of shadows and sails, was not a single moment, but a long wave that rose slowly across the oceans and then broke, scattering its foam across history. It is usually remembered as stretching from about the year 1650 until around the year 1730, less than a century in all, yet rich with tales that would echo far longer than the pirates themselves ever lived. To drift through this period is to move with the tides of empire, to listen to the voices of sailors whispering in the dark, to feel the tension of wealth flowing endlessly across the seas, while countless hungry eyes watched from the shore. The first stirrings of this age were felt in the mid-17th century, when Europe was locked in a cycle of wars that spilled far beyond its own shores. The Caribbean, the coasts of West Africa, and the new ports of North America became battlegrounds where merchant fleets carried the spoils of empire. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands all vied for dominance, and into this storm stepped the men who would come to embody piracy. At first, they bore licenses of war, those letters of marque that turned simple sailors into privateers. With a signature and a seal, a man could raid an enemy vessel, seize its cargo, and carry it back to port as a lawful prize. These privateers thrived while the wars raged, and the Caribbean in particular became their hunting ground. But wars do not last forever, and when treaties were signed, the permissions vanished. The men, however, remained. By 1670, countless sailors, hardened by years of raiding, found themselves stranded in a world that no longer wanted them. They had tasted the sweetness of plunder, had lived the life of adventure, and now faced the dreary return to poverty. Many simply refused. Thus the line between privateer and pirate blurred until it vanished altogether. Ships that once sailed with the blessing of a king now sailed under the black flag, answerable only to themselves. From 1670 to the early 1690s, piracy grew steadily across the Caribbean. The geography of the region favored them. Narrow straits, hidden coves, and islands without number offered endless hiding places. Merchant ships, heavy with sugar, tobacco, rum, and silver, passed constantly through these waters. With navies stretched thin, pirates found opportunity at every horizon. In these decades, buccaneers and freebooters flourished, some attacking not only ships but coastal towns and settlements. Their names became murmurs of dread along the Spanish Main, the stretch of coast from Mexico down through Central and South America. By the turn of the century, piracy had begun to spread far beyond the Caribbean. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 marked a turning point. That war had created vast fleets of privateers, men who once again served their nations by raiding enemy commerce. But when peace came, the cycle repeated. Hundreds of ships were decommissioned, thousands of sailors discharged, and many turned to piracy rather than starve. This flood of unemployed men onto the seas helped ignite what historians often call the high point of the Golden Age, the years from 1710 to about 1720. It was in these years that the figures we now know as legends made their appearance. Edward Teach, remembered as Blackbeard, terrorized the coasts of the American colonies and the Caribbean. His black beard, twisted into coils with burning fuses, became a vision of terror meant to make enemies surrender before a single shot was fired. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, captured more than 400 ships during his brief career, a number unmatched by any of his peers. Bonny and Mary Read defied every expectation of their age, donning men's clothing and fighting alongside their crews with ferocity. Calico Jack Rackham sailed with his distinctive flag, two crossed swords beneath a skull, a banner that would one day become one of the most famous symbols of piracy. This decade of 1710 to 1720 was the true heart of the Golden Age, when piracy seemed to flourish across every ocean. The Caribbean remained central, but pirates also struck along the American eastern seaboard, from New York to Charleston. Others sailed farther afield, raiding along the coast of West Africa, where slave ships and gold traders passed. Still others reached the Indian Ocean, haunting the routes between the Red Sea, India, and the rich ports of the East Indies. The world's trade was expanding, and piracy expanded with it, riding the same currents, following the same winds. Life aboard a pirate ship during this time reflected the spirit of rebellion that had given birth to piracy in the first place. Crews often drew up articles, codes of conduct that governed their behavior. Captains were elected and could be removed by the crew if they failed to lead well. Plunder was divided according to shares, with even the lowliest sailor receiving a portion, while those who were wounded in battle received extra compensation. These rules were not born from idealism alone, but from necessity. Only through fairness could men be kept loyal in a world where death was always close at hand. Yet compared to the strict and often brutal hierarchy of naval and merchant ships, pirate codes offered a rare glimpse of equality, and for many, that was reason enough to choose the black flag. Yet the age could not last forever. By 1720, the empires of Europe had grown weary of losing their treasure to men they called outlaws. The colonies on the American coast, once tolerant of pirates who brought goods to trade, began to turn against them. Naval patrols increased, governors were ordered to act, and special commissions were established to try captured pirates quickly. Famous figures were hunted down. Blackbeard killed in a fierce battle off North Carolina in 1718, Black Bart Roberts slain in 1722, and Calico Jack captured in Jamaica in 1720. Dozens, even hundreds of pirates were hanged in these years, their bodies left to rot in iron cages as warnings at harbor entrances. By the mid-1720s, the Great Wave had begun to recede. Some pirates fled to distant waters, hiding among the islands of Madagascar or slipping quietly into other trades. Others took advantage of royal pardons, offers of mercy that allowed them to abandon their former lives without punishment. But for many, there was no escape, and the gallows claimed them. By 1730, the Golden Age of Piracy was, for the most part, over. Yet while the age itself was brief, its echoes stretched far. The Skull and Crossbones, the Jolly Roger, became one of the most enduring symbols in history. Tales of daring battles, of buried treasure, of secret coves and fearless captains. captured the imagination of generations. Writers and storytellers, long after the last pirate had swung from the gallows, breathed life back into their memory, weaving fact with fiction until the pirates of history became the pirates of legend. Looking back across the arc of those 80 years, from 1650 to 1730, one can see how the age was shaped less by individual men and more by the tides of history itself. Wars created sailors, peace abandoned them. Empires stretched themselves across the globe, creating opportunities too tempting for outlaws to resist. The hunger for wealth, the cruelty of naval discipline, the lure of freedom, all combined to create a storm that swept across the seas for a single human lifetime and then was gone. And so the Golden Age of Piracy lives now only in memory, its timeline a brief but brilliant flare upon the long sea of history. It rose from war, thrived in chaos, and fell beneath the weight of empire. But if you listen closely, as you drift toward rest, you may still hear it, the faint echo of a distant cannon, the whisper of a black flag unfurling in the wind, the creak of a wooden deck beneath bare feet. The age has passed, but its story remains, sailing forever in the quiet corners of the imagination. When most people think of pirates, they imagine wild chaos, men drunk on rum, screaming in battle, fighting only for themselves with no thought of law or order. Yet the truth of pirate society was more complex, and perhaps more surprising, than the legends suggest. For beneath the fluttering black flags and the roar of cannon fire, there existed a world of rules, of customs, of agreements made among equals. Pirate ships were not kingdoms ruled by tyrants, but floating experiments in democracy, carved out upon the restless surface of the sea. To understand why this way of life arose, one must first look at the world from which these men came. Merchant ships and naval vessels of the 17th and 18th centuries were harsh places. Authority belonged to the captain alone, and his word was law. He could order punishments at will, whippings, confinement in chains, even death. Sailors were often cheated of their wages, forced to eat food that rotted in the barrels, and made to work to exhaustion with little regard for their health. The common seaman was treated less like a human being and more like a tool to be used until it broke. When men abandoned such ships to join the ranks of pirates, they carried with them the memory of that suffering. They had no desire to reproduce the tyranny of naval life aboard their new vessels. And so, almost instinctively, they created something different, codes of conduct that bound every member of the crew, captain included. These codes were not mere suggestions, but contracts agreed upon by all before a voyage began. They laid out how plunder would be divided, how discipline would be maintained, and how disputes would be settled. In many ways, they were charters of freedom, crude yet remarkable. A typical pirate code might state that the captain was elected by the crew, and that he could be deposed if he failed to lead with courage or fairness. Decisions of great importance, such as whether to engage in battle or where to sail, were often put to a vote. In this, pirates were far ahead of their time, practicing a rough democracy in an age when most of the world was ruled by kings and emperors. On these ships, each man's voice carried weight, no matter his background. Plunder, too, was divided with fairness that would have been unimaginable aboard a merchantman. A captain might receive 2 or 3 shares, the quartermaster 1 or 2, but the common sailor always received at least 1 full share. This meant that the wealth taken upon the seas was spread widely among the crew, rather than concentrated in the hands of the few. To a sailor who had once been paid a pittance while merchants grew rich from his labor, this must have felt like justice. Compensation was also given for injury, something unheard of in the navies of the time. A man who lost an arm might be given 600 pieces of 8, one who lost an eye 100. This recognition of sacrifice reflected the bonds that tied crews together. They fought as brothers, and when one was wounded, the others bore the cost. Such practices gave pirates a sense of belonging that the wider world had denied them. The figure of the quartermaster deserves special mention in this society. If the captain commanded in battle, the quartermaster balanced his power in times of peace. He oversaw the distribution of plunder, settled disputes, and ensured that discipline was maintained according to the code. In many ways, he was the guardian of fairness, a check against tyranny. The existence of such a role shows how deeply pirates feared the return of the old hierarchies they had fled. Daily life aboard a pirate ship was harsh, but carried a strange sense of equality. Food and drink were shared, though often scarce. Rum was common, sometimes mixed with water and sugar to create grog. Meals might consist of salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and whatever could be caught or stolen. Yet all partook alike. There was no fine table for the captain, no special stores for officers alone. Music and storytelling filled the evenings, with fiddles, drums, and songs lifting spirits beneath the stars. In these moments, amid laughter and shared tales, the bonds of brotherhood were woven tighter still. Punishments existed, of course, for piracy was a dangerous business that demanded discipline, but even these were often subject to the code. Theft from a fellow pirate might be punished by marooning, a cruel fate of being left alone on a deserted island with a pistol and little else. Cowardice in battle, betrayal of the crew, or disobedience could bring death. Yet, unlike the arbitrary cruelty of naval captains, these punishments were agreed upon by all, and each man knew the risks he faced. The society of pirates was also remarkable in its diversity. Crews often included men from many nations: English, French, Dutch, Spanish, African, and even escaped slaves or freedmen. The sea cared little for borders, and so did the pirates. On their ships, what mattered was loyalty and courage, not race or birth. While the wider world was bound by rigid hierarchies of class and color, pirate ships offered a rare refuge where such lines blurred. Some records even tell of black men holding positions of authority aboard pirate vessels, a freedom nearly unthinkable elsewhere in the 18th century. Women, though rare, were not entirely absent, and Bonny and Mary Read remained the most famous, disguising themselves as men until their identities were revealed and fighting with as much ferocity as any of their crewmates. Their stories stand as reminders that pirate society, though far from a paradise, could break the chains of convention in unexpected ways. Pirates also developed rituals and symbols that bound them together. The black flag, often adorned with skulls, skeletons, or weapons, was more than a tool of terror. It was a banner of defiance, a statement that these men lived outside the laws of nations and under their own. When such a flag appeared on the horizon, it spoke not only of danger but of identity. We are pirates, and we will not bow. The presence of such order within what outsiders called lawlessness puzzled many of the time. Governors and merchants, when they captured pirate articles, often remarked on the strange fairness they contained. Some even feared that the example of pirates might inspire rebellion on land, for if sailors could govern themselves upon the sea, might not common men do the same on shore? In this way, pirate society held a quiet but radical power, challenging the assumptions of authority in an age of monarchs. Yet it must not be imagined as utopia. Life was still violent, still uncertain, still marked by hardship. Quarrels broke out, ships were lost to storms or battles, and disease could sweep through a crew without mercy. But for men who had known only oppression, this rough equality was precious. In the creaking of the timbers, in the flap of sails above, they found a measure of freedom denied them on land. As the Golden Age progressed, stories of pirate society spread, told in whispers by sailors in taverns and ports. Young men heard of ships where captains were chosen, where plunder was shared, where a man could rise by his courage alone. To those weary of hunger and chains, such tales were invitations, promises that another life was possible. And so, the ranks of pirates grew, fed not only by desperation, but by the allure of a society that, however imperfect, offered dignity. When the age finally drew to its close, when the hangman's noose silenced the voices of those who had lived upon the black flag, their society too was scattered. Yet its memory endured. The articles they wrote, the customs they lived, the equality they demanded, all became part of the legend. Later generations, looking back, would see in these men not merely criminals, but dreamers of another order, rebels who carved a fleeting democracy upon the waves. And as you drift into rest, you might imagine yourself upon such a deck, the sea stretching endless in every direction, the stars bright above, the wind filling the sails. Around you, men and women laugh, share food, sing songs. No master's whip cracks here, no king commands your fate. You are part of a brotherhood, bound by choice, by courage, by the fragile dream that freedom can exist, even if only for a moment, upon the restless sea. The golden age of piracy would be only a shadow of itself without the larger-than-life figures who strode across its stage, men and women whose names have become legends whispered through time. Though their lives were brief, often measured in just a handful of years, their stories shine like constellations in the night sky of history, guiding our imagination whenever we think of the black flag and the rolling seas. To speak of the age is to speak of them, and as the waves carry us back to those restless years, we find ourselves in the company of some of the most famous pirates ever to have lived. Among them, none looms larger than Edward Teach, the man the world remembers as Blackbeard. He was not born a monster, but an ordinary English sailor, likely from Bristol, who found his way to the Caribbean during the great wars of empire. He began his career as many others did, serving as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession. When peace came and opportunities vanished, he chose piracy, and in a few short years he would become its most feared symbol. Blackbeard was a master of theatrics. He understood that fear could win battles without bloodshed, and so he cultivated an image of terror. His beard, long and dark, he tied into braids and fastened with slow, burning fuses, so that in battle, smoke curled around his face like the breath of a demon. His ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a captured French vessel refitted for war, bristling with cannon. When it appeared on the horizon, many merchant crews surrendered without firing a shot, preferring to yield than to face the specter of Blackbeard. Yet behind the mask of terror, some stories tell that Teach could be almost gentle with those he captured, often sparing lives once plunder was taken. His reign, however, was brief. In November of 1718, off the coast of North Carolina, he met his end in a fierce battle against British naval forces. It is said he fought like a lion, sustaining multiple wounds before he finally fell. His head was taken and hung from the bowsprit of his conqueror's ship, a grim trophy meant to terrify others, but his legend did not die. To this day, the name Blackbeard stirs images of fire, smoke, and the dark romance of the sea. If Blackbeard embodied terror, Bartholomew Roberts embodied discipline and success. Known as Black Bart, he was a Welshman who began his life at sea, not as a pirate, but as an ordinary sailor aboard a ship that was captured by pirates in 1719. At first reluctant, he soon embraced the life, rising swiftly through skill and courage. Within weeks, he was chosen as captain, and under his leadership, his crew flourished. Roberts was not the wild, drunken figure of popular imagination. He was known for his elegance, often dressing in fine clothes, and for his strict rules against gambling and drunkenness aboard ship. His men admired him, for he brought them victories time and again. In a career that lasted barely 3 years, Roberts captured more than 400 ships, a number unmatched by any other pirate of the era. His reach extended across the Atlantic, from the Caribbean to the coast of Brazil, from the American colonies to the shores of West Africa. He carried with him not only a sword, but also a sense of destiny, once declaring that it was better to be a short-lived king of the sea than a long-lived common man. His end came in 1722, when he was killed in battle off the coast of Africa. His crew, unwilling to see his body dishonored, cast him into the sea in full dress, burying him in the waters he had ruled. Though his reign was short, his exploits cemented him as one of the greatest pirates in history. If Roberts and Blackbeard represent the power of terror and discipline, Bonny and Mary Read remind us that piracy was not solely a man's domain. Their lives, though tangled with myth, reveal a defiance of the roles society tried to force upon them. Bonny was born in Ireland, the daughter of a lawyer, but her family's fortunes shifted, and she found herself in the New World. Bold and fiery, she married young, but her restless spirit could not be contained by domestic life. She left her husband to join the pirate calico Jack Rackham, sailing with him and embracing the life of the outlaw. Disguised at first as a man, she soon revealed her identity, fighting openly as a woman, fearless in battle and sharp of tongue. Mary Read's story was equally unusual. Born in England, she was dressed as a boy by her mother to secure an inheritance, and she lived much of her early life under a male identity. She served in the military, fought with courage, and later found her way to sea. When her ship was captured by pirates, she joined them, continuing her life of disguise until her true self was revealed. Together, Anne and Mary sailed with Calico Jack, and together they fought with ferocity. Accounts tell of their courage in battle, how they stood and fought even as their male crewmates faltered. When Calico Jack's ship was finally captured in 1720, the two women resisted fiercely, though they were eventually subdued. Sentenced to death, both claimed to be pregnant, and thus their executions were delayed. Mary Read died in prison, but Bonny's fate remains uncertain. Some say she too died behind bars, others that she was released and lived quietly thereafter. Whatever the truth, their stories became symbols of defiance, reminders that the spirit of piracy could not be confined by gender. Calico Jack Rackham himself, though less formidable than Blackbeard or Roberts, left behind one of the most enduring symbols of piracy, the flag. His banner, a skull above two crossed swords, would evolve into the Jolly Roger we recognize today. Rackham was not known for great victories at sea, but his partnership with Bonny and Mary Read, and his association with the Black Flag, ensured his place in legend. His life ended in 1720, when he was captured by the authorities in Jamaica and hanged. Yet the image of his flag continued to fly in imagination long after the man was gone. There were others too, men whose names are less familiar, but whose deeds filled the seas with fear. Henry Every, sometimes called Long Ben, captured the treasure ship Gan, Jais Sawai of the Mughal Empire, one of the richest prizes ever taken by pirates. William Kidd, remembered as Captain Kidd, began as a privateer and ended as a pirate, hanged in London in 1701, his body left to rot in chains as a warning. Samuel Bellamy, the so-called Black Sam, was known as the Prince of Pirates, beloved by his crew for his fairness and courage, until his ship, the Whydah, went down in a storm off Cape Cod in 1717, taking him and most of his men with it. Each of these lives, brief as sparks upon the water, added to the constellation of stories that light the sky of the Golden Age. What binds these figures together is not merely their crimes but their larger-than-life presence. They became more than men and women, they became symbols. Blackbeard with his smoking beard, Roberts with his elegance and discipline, Anne and Mary with their defiance, Rackham with his flag, all embodied different facets of what piracy meant. To their enemies, they were criminals, scourges of the sea. To their crews, they were leaders, comrades, sometimes even heroes. To us, across the centuries, they are legends, their lives blurred by time but still vivid in imagination. Their stories remind us of the strange mixture that piracy represented: freedom and brutality, equality and violence, defiance and despair. They lived outside the bounds of law, yet within the codes they themselves wrote. They sought wealth, but also dignity, respect, and the right to live on their own terms. And though most met violent ends, their names have outlived the kings and governors who condemned them. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the figures moving across the stage of history, each one a flicker of light upon the waves. Blackbeard, looming with smoke curling from his beard; Roberts, standing proud in his fine coat, a disciplined commander; Anne and Mary, blades flashing in the chaos of battle, refusing to bow; Rackham, his flag snapping in the wind, a symbol more enduring than his life. Around them, the sea stretches endless, the stars wheel slowly above, and the wind carries the faint echoes of their voices. They are gone, but their legends sail forever, timeless upon the ocean of memory. The Golden Age of Piracy, for all its fire and fury, was never destined to last forever. It was born in the wake of war, when chaos spread across the seas and opportunity beckoned, but empires are not blind for long. What begins as a crack in the armor of order soon becomes a wound that nations cannot ignore. And so, as quickly as the age had risen, so too it began to fall, undone by the very forces of history that had given it life. To understand the decline of piracy is to watch a tide retreat, slowly at first, then with a pull so strong that even the fiercest captains could not resist. In the early years, pirates thrived because the powers of Europe were exhausted from endless conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession had drained treasuries, scattered navies, and left many experienced sailors without purpose. The Caribbean, the coast of Africa, and the Indian Ocean lay open, with trade swelling and protection scarce. For a time, piracy flourished in this space between war and peace, but peace is never truly peaceful for long. As nations rebuilt their fleets and turned their eyes once more to commerce, they recognized that the prosperity of their colonies and merchants could not survive if left exposed to the cutlasses and cannons of outlaw crews. The first step in the decline was political resolve. Governments that had once turned a blind eye to pirates, sometimes even profiting from their raids, began to see them as enemies. Colonial governors who had once shared drinks with captains in smoky taverns suddenly found themselves under pressure to stamp out the very people they had tolerated. The British Crown, in particular, launched an aggressive campaign against piracy in the Americas. Governors were given orders to hunt pirates relentlessly, and royal pardons were offered to those willing to lay down their arms. For some, the promise of amnesty was tempting. Dozens of pirates accepted the king's pardon, leaving the life behind in exchange for survival. Yet many returned to piracy when honest living proved harsh, and for those who refused to surrender, the noose awaited. Naval power was the second wave of the storm that crushed piracy. At the height of the Golden Age, pirate crews often outgunned the small merchant vessels they preyed upon, and local militias were no match for hardened freebooters. But as the Royal Navy, the Spanish Armada, and the French fleets rebuilt their strength. They began to patrol the waters more heavily. Warships, faster and deadlier than before, pursued pirates with relentless determination. Battles that once tilted in the pirates' favor now ended in disaster, as their makeshift fleets could not stand against disciplined squadrons of trained sailors. The sea, once a playground for the daring, became a hunting ground where the hunters were no longer pirates but kings and empires. One by one, the legendary captains fell. In 1718, Blackbeard met his end off the coast of North Carolina, struck down in a furious battle with British naval forces. His death sent a chilling message across the Caribbean. Even the most feared could be hunted and destroyed. The same year, Charles Vane was captured, tried, and hanged in Jamaica, his body swinging in the tropical breeze as a warning. 2 years later, Calico Jack Rackham was seized, his flag pulled down, his crew scattered, and his name etched into the list of those who could not escape the tightening net. Perhaps the most decisive blow came in 1722 when Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful of all, was killed off the coast of West Africa. Roberts had taken more than 400 ships, his reach spanning continents, his name feared from Brazil to the Gold Coast. But when he fell to a broadside from a British warship, his crew scattered, and his body slipped into the sea. The last of the great kings of the pirates was gone. With him, much of the spirit of the Golden Age perished, for none who came after matched his daring or his success. Alongside these deaths came the spectacle of punishment. Pirates were not merely killed, they were made examples of. In London, Port Royal, and the colonies, gallows were erected, and the bodies of captured pirates were left to rot in chains, their bones picked clean by birds, their forms looming over harbors as silent warnings to any who still dreamed of freedom. The sight of a skeleton swaying in the salt wind was a message more powerful than cannon fire. The age of piracy was ending, and those who clung to it would meet only shame and death. But the decline was not only the work of warships and gallows. Trade itself changed, and with it, the opportunities that had once nourished piracy. As empires strengthened their hold on colonies, they developed more secure systems of commerce. Convoys of ships sailed together under guard, reducing the vulnerability of single vessels. Naval escorts became common, ensuring that treasure fleets and merchant cargoes reached their destinations more safely. Ports once friendly to pirates closed their doors, fearing the wrath of kings and the loss of legitimate trade. Havana, Port Royal, Nassau, all places that had once welcomed or tolerated outlaws, turned against them, driving them out into the open sea where survival was far more difficult. Technology, too, played its part. Naval vessels became swifter, their firepower greater, their crews better trained. The ragtag fleets of the pirates, often cobbled together from captured merchantmen, could not compete with the precision and strength of a renewed naval presence. Even the once formidable Queen Anne's Revenge or Royal Fortune paled in comparison to ships of the line bearing the flags of great nations. By the mid-1720s, piracy was collapsing. A few stubborn figures continued to roam, the remnants of crews that had once terrified the seas, but their numbers dwindled with each passing year. Captains like Ned Lowe, infamous for his cruelty, carried on the tradition of terror, but his brutality brought him no lasting power. He vanished into obscurity, his fate uncertain, his legacy one of horror rather than glory. Others fled to distant waters, seeking refuge in the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea. But the age of global empires meant that even there, the long arm of authority could reach. What had once been a roaring fire became a flicker. By the 1730s, the Golden Age was over. The seas still held pirates, of course, for piracy has never truly died, but the era of great names, of flags unfurled in defiance, of fleets brought low by ragged crews, had passed into memory. The oceans were again the dominion of kings and merchants, their profits flowing into coffers, their trade lanes patrolled and defended. Yet even as piracy declined in reality, it grew in legend. The very efforts to erase it, the trials, the executions, the sermons preached against it, gave it a kind of immortality. Tales of Blackbeard's fiery visage, of Roberts's elegance, of Annebonny's defiance, spread like whispers through taverns and ports. Sailors carried these stories across oceans, and each retelling made the pirates larger, grander, more myth than man. In trying to stamp them out, the authorities ensured that their memory would outlast them, for fear has a way of turning into fascination, and condemnation into romance. And so the decline of piracy was not only the end of an age, but also the beginning of a legend. The gallows silenced voices, but not the imagination. The warships cleared the seas, but not the songs sung in the night. What was lost in flesh and blood was reborn in story, and from the ashes of the Golden Age, a myth took shape that has endured for centuries. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the fading of that age as a tide pulling back from the shore. Ships that once prowled the Caribbean fade into mist, their sails lowering, their cannons silent. The cries of battle give way to the quiet of waves against the hull. In distant harbors, the gallows stand empty, the last bodies taken down, the last warnings given. The sea, eternal and indifferent, rolls on, carrying away the echoes of an age now past. Yet somewhere in the depths of time, the spirit of those years lingers, not in the world of men, but in the world of memory, where pirates still sail forever, free and defiant, upon the endless ocean of legend. When the Golden Age of Piracy ended, when the last ships were captured, when the last captains were hanged or disappeared into obscurity, it might have seemed that piracy would vanish from memory. Empires had triumphed, the seas had been secured, and the trade of nations flowed once more with fewer threats upon the waves. Yet in truth, the age of piracy did not end at the gallows. It transformed. What the world lost in flesh and blood, it gained in story, and that story has never truly ended. If the seas were cleared of pirates, the imagination of humanity was not, and in the centuries that followed, piracy became something greater than its reality had ever been. It became legend. Part of this enduring legacy lies in the power of symbols. Few emblems in human history have carried such weight as the Black Flag, the Jolly Roger, with its skull and crossbones staring out in silent defiance. For sailors of the 18th century, the sight of such a flag brought terror, for it promised no mercy if resistance was shown. But once the age had ended, the same symbol took on new meaning. The skull became not just a threat, but a sign of rebellion, of freedom, of those who lived outside the chains of ordinary life. The Black Flag, fluttering in stories and art, came to stand for defiance against authority itself. Even today, centuries later, that skull and crossbones is recognized everywhere, carrying with it the echo of ships long gone. The legacy also endured through the telling of stories. Sailors are storytellers by nature, and in taverns across the world, the tales of pirates were told and retold, often growing grander with each retelling. The truth of Blackbeard's final battle was terrifying enough, but in story it became myth, with his beard blazing with fire, his body rising even after death, his ghost haunting the coastlines. Bartholomew Roberts, who dressed with elegance and commanded with precision, was remembered as a noble rogue, a gentleman of the seas. Bonny and Mary Read, who defied the expectations of their age, became figures of fascination, their courage admired even as their crimes were condemned. The longer time passed, the less the world remembered their cruelty or the suffering they inflicted, and the more it remembered their daring, their courage, their refusal to be bound by the ordinary chains of society. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, writers began to shape these stories into literature. The pirate became not only a figure of fear, but a character in drama and fiction. Plays were staged, ballads were sung, and slowly, the image of the pirate shifted from a real-world criminal to a romanticized hero. By the time the Victorian era arrived, piracy was already something of the past, yet it lived vividly in the pages of novels. One of the most famous of these was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, a tale that brought to life characters like Long John Silver, whose charm and cunning made him unforgettable. Stevenson's work cemented the pirate as a permanent figure in literature, not as a mere outlaw, but as an anti-hero, someone dangerous yet irresistible, a rebel who lived by his own code. This romantic image was far removed from the truth, of course. Real pirates were often brutal, their lives harsh, their deaths quick and violent. But legends rarely care for accuracy. Legends grow from the soil of imagination, watered by longing and fear and wonder. The world wanted pirates to be larger than life, to be symbols of freedom in a world that was often bound by rules and restrictions. And so, the legacy took root not in reality, but in the collective dream of humanity. Even the language of pirates has survived, though many of the phrases we associate with them today are more invention than fact. Words like ahoy, avast, and matey echo across centuries. The stereotype of the pirate's voice, with its rough growl and rolling R's, owes more to stage plays and actors than to history, yet it has become universal. It is a voice that belongs to no single person, but to the idea of piracy itself. When someone pretends to be a pirate, they do not imitate Edward Teach or Bartholomew Roberts. They imitate the myth, the collective image that has been passed down through story and song. The influence of piracy also endures in the world of film and entertainment. From the early silent movies of the 20th century to the sweeping epics of Hollywood, pirates have never lost their allure. The black flag has flown across cinema screens, from Errol Flynn's swashbuckling adventures to the fantastical worlds of modern blockbusters. The Pirates of the Caribbean films, with their mix of history and fantasy, proved that even in the 21st century, the legend still has power to captivate millions. In amusement parks, on Halloween nights, in children's games, the pirate remains a beloved figure, a symbol of adventure and mischief. But perhaps the deepest legacy of piracy is not in symbols or stories, but in the human longing it represents. At its heart, the pirate is a dream of freedom. He or she is the one who refuses to bow, who takes what they wish, who sails beyond the horizon with no master but the sea. It is a dangerous freedom, often cruel, but it is freedom nonetheless, and in every age there are those who long for such release. That longing explains why the pirate myth has endured while so many other figures of history have faded. The knight, the musketeer, the cowboy, all live in legend, but the pirate stands apart because the ocean is eternal and the dream of escape is eternal too. Even in our modern world, where satellites watch the seas and ships are tracked across vast distances, piracy has not vanished entirely. In places like the Horn of Africa, the Strait of Malacca, or the coasts of West Africa, modern pirates still exist. They no longer fly the Jolly Roger or duel with cutlasses, but the act itself, the seizing of ships, the challenge to authority on the high seas, reminds us that the spirit of piracy is older than nations, older than navies, and will always find new shapes. Yet even here, the image of the pirate in popular imagination is shaped not by these modern criminals, but by the legends of the Golden Age, the ghosts of a time when the seas themselves seemed alive with rebellion. Museums today display relics of that past, pistols corroded by salt, fragments of flags, coins stamped with foreign kings that once clinked in the pockets of buccaneers. Scholars pore over trial records, studying the words of men and women who lived and died by piracy. In these fragments, the real history can still be glimpsed. But alongside the history runs the myth, stronger and more enduring. It is in art, in songs, in the laughter of children pretending to sail the seas, in the thrill of adults who watch films or read novels, imagining themselves on the deck of a ship with the wind in their hair and the horizon unbound. The enduring legacy of piracy is, in many ways, the enduring legacy of the sea itself. The ocean is vast, mysterious, and untamed. It calls to the restless, to the dreamers, to those who wish to slip away from the constraints of land. Pirates embodied that call, answering it with violence and daring, but leaving behind a myth that speaks to something deeper in the human soul. They remind us that beyond the borders of law and order lies a space of possibility, a space where freedom and danger walk hand in hand. As centuries pass, the reality of the Golden Age of Piracy grows more distant, but the legacy grows closer, for it is carried not in ships or cannons, but in minds and hearts. To tell the story of pirates is to tell a story of defiance, of the dream of living unbound. It is a story that will never fade, because it does not belong to one time or one place. It belongs to humanity itself, to the eternal dream of the horizon. So when you hear the whisper of the sea in a seashell, or the crash of waves against a rocky shore, perhaps you can also hear the faint echo of a pirate's laugh, carried across the centuries. Not a laugh of cruelty, but of freedom, of one who lived outside the lines, who dared to take what others only dreamed of. That echo is the true legacy, the reason why the Golden Age has never truly ended, why the black flag still flies in imagination. For as long as people dream of escape, as long as they long for the freedom of the open sea, pirates will sail forever, not upon the waters of the world, but upon the endless oceans of story and legend.